My name is Elise Gardner, and the moment my manager Croft Brennan told me my dying father wasn't his problem, changed everything about who I thought I was. I stood in that sterile break room, still wearing my stained uniform from the diner where I'd spent 3 years serving coffee to people who barely acknowledged my existence, begging this man for 1 week off because my dad was taking his final breaths in room 247 of General Hospital. Croft didn't even look up from his scheduling papers when he said, "Find coverage or don't bother coming back. Your personal drama isn't my concern." The words hit me like a freight train, derailing everything I believed about basic human decency. I'd worked every holiday, covered every sick shift, stayed late without complaint, and this was my reward. My father, the quiet man who raised me alone after my mother abandoned us when I was 7, was dying. And this creature wearing a cheap tie was more concerned about weekend lunch rush coverage than my heart breaking into a million pieces. Before I tell you what happened next, could you please take a few seconds to tell me if you've ever had someone dismiss the most important moment of your life like it meant absolutely nothing? Because what I discovered about my father, and what I did to that manager, will change how you think about revenge forever. You need to hear this story until the very end. And also like, subscribe, and click the bell icon because this gets so much more twisted than you could ever imagine. I walked out of that diner without saying another word. Croft's voice followed me through the kitchen, shouting about how I'd never work in this town again, how he'd make sure everyone knew I was unreliable. I drove straight to the hospital, where my father lay connected to machines that beeped with the rhythm of his fading life. Arlo Gardner had been my whole world since I was a child. He worked from home doing what he called number crunching for boring government stuff. Always hunched over multiple computer screens in our cramped apartment, wearing the same 3 button-down shirts he'd owned for a decade. Dad died on a Tuesday morning while I held his weathered hand. The nurse said he went peacefully, but peace felt impossible when my entire support system evaporated in that sterile room. I spent the next 6 days arranging a funeral I couldn't afford, fielding calls from his few colleagues who seemed genuinely shocked by his passing, and trying to figure out how someone making $11.5 an hour was supposed to handle burial costs, rent, and basic survival. The funeral was small. A handful of his coworkers showed up, along with Mrs. Patterson from next door, who always complained about our television being too loud, but there were also 3 men in expensive suits who stood at the back of the chapel, never introducing themselves, just watching with the kind of intensity that made my skin crawl. When I approached them after the service, they simply nodded respectfully and left without explanation. Returning to work the following Monday felt like stepping back into a nightmare I'd temporarily escaped. The diner looked exactly the same, smelled the same, sounded the same. Croft stood behind the counter, that perpetual sneer painted across his face like he'd been born wearing it. The other waitresses, Penny and Rue, gave me sympathetic looks but kept their distance. Everyone knew what had happened, and everyone knew better than to cross Croft. I tied my apron around my waist and grabbed my order pad, expecting the usual morning rush of construction workers and office people grabbing coffee before their real lives began. But something felt different. The kitchen staff kept glancing toward the front entrance, and Penny kept checking her phone with worried expressions. Then I saw him. A man in a tailored navy suit stood by the host station, scanning the dining room with the focused attention of someone conducting surveillance. He wasn't here for pancakes or coffee. His presence commanded attention in a way that made conversations pause and customers turn in their chairs. When his gaze landed on me, recognition flickered across his features. Elise Gardner. His voice carried authority that made my name sound important for the first time in years. I nodded, suddenly aware of how ridiculous I must look in my polyester uniform with its grease stains and frayed edges. My name is Director Hayes with the Treasury Financial Crimes Division. We need to talk. The words hit me like lightning. Treasury Financial Crimes Division. Government authority. The kind of serious business that had nothing to do with diner waitresses or people like me. Croft materialized beside us with that oily smile he reserved for customers he thought might complain to corporate. Is there a problem here? Because Elise just lost her father and she's been a bit emotional lately. Director Hayes fixed Croft with a stare that could have frozen boiling water. Actually, there's no problem at all. Miss Gardner, could we speak privately? I untied my apron and followed him outside, leaving Croft standing there with his mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. We sat in his government sedan, And Director Hayes opened a briefcase that contained documents with my father's name printed across the top in bold letters. "Your father was one of our most valuable forensic accountants," he began, and I felt my understanding of reality start to crumble. For 15 years, Arlo conducted covert audits of major corporations suspected of tax evasion. His work was so thorough, so methodical, that we built our entire prosecution strategy around his findings. I stared at the documents, seeing my father's name attached to case files involving millions of dollars. This quiet man, who wore the same 3 shirts and ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day, had been living a completely different life than the one I knew. "The company you work for," Director Hayes continued, pointing toward the diner, "was his final assignment. Hartwell Food Services has been systematically evading federal taxes for 8 years. Your father documented everything: shell companies, offshore accounts, falsified employee records, tip theft, wage manipulation. The evidence he compiled could put the executives in federal prison for decades." My world tilted sideways. I'd been serving coffee to criminals who were stealing from their own workers, while my father secretly built the case that would destroy them. "But here's our problem," Director Hayes said, his expression growing grave. "Your father was paranoid about digital security. He encrypted all his findings and stored them in cryptocurrency wallets with access keys that only he knew. We've been searching his apartment, his computers, everything, and we can't find those keys anywhere." What does that mean? It means 8 years of evidence just disappeared when your father died, unless he studied my face carefully, unless he left you some way to access those files. I thought about Dad's desk at home, still exactly as he'd left it. Stacks of notebooks filled with numbers and codes that looked like gibberish, USB drives labeled with dates and random letters, a safe hidden behind his bedroom dresser that I'd never opened because I didn't know the combination. "He might have," I said slowly. Director Hayes leaned forward. "Miss Gardner, those files contain evidence of tax evasion totaling $47 million. If we can recover them, your father's work will take down one of the largest corporate fraud schemes we've ever investigated." $47 million. The number felt astronomical, impossible, completely disconnected from my world of dollar tips and day-old pastries. "What happens if I find these files?" "Justice," he said simply, "and a substantial reward for your cooperation." I returned to work that afternoon feeling like I was living in someone else's life. Croft watched me with suspicious eyes, probably wondering why government agents were pulling his employees aside for private conversations. I poured coffee and took orders on autopilot while my mind raced through everything I thought I knew about my father. That evening, I sat in Dad's chair and really looked at his workspace for the first time. The notebooks weren't random. They followed patterns, sequences, mathematical progressions that meant something to someone who understood their logic. The USB drives were labeled with dates that corresponded to specific entries in his handwritten notes. The safe combination took me 3 hours to figure out. Dad always said I was the smartest person he knew, and apparently he'd hidden the answer in plain sight. His birthday, my birthday, and the date my mother left us, arranged in the order they'd shaped our lives together. Inside the safe, I found a single envelope with my name written in his careful handwriting. The letter inside contained 24 alphanumeric sequences, each labeled with a company name. Hartwell Food Services was number 17 on the list. The next morning, I dressed for work knowing everything was about to change. But first, I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with and how deep this conspiracy went. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. Croft's expensive watch despite the diner's supposedly struggling finances, the way he processed cash tips that never made it onto official records, the mysterious late-night meetings he held in the office with men who definitely weren't food suppliers. Penny mentioned that her overtime hours never appeared on her pay-ups. RU complained about health insurance deductions that never resulted in actual coverage. The kitchen staff worked split shifts to avoid full-time benefits, but somehow the scheduling always guaranteed they'd work just enough hours to be considered part-time. I began documenting everything: shift schedules that violated labor laws, cash register readings that didn't match reported sales, customer counts that seemed impossible given the actual foot traffic. Every detail my father would have noticed if he'd been investigating this place. 3 weeks after the funeral, I'd accumulated enough evidence to understand the scope of what Dad had been building. Hartwell Food Services wasn't just evading taxes. They were systematically stealing from every employee who worked for them, while creating fraudulent records that made the whole operation look legitimate. But I also realized something else. I didn't have to give this evidence to the government immediately. I had other options. Late one night I researched Hartwell's main competitor, a company called Summit Restaurant Group that had been trying to expand into our territory for months. They'd made several attempts to buy out Hartwell's locations, but the deals always fell through due to what the business journals called regulatory complications. I wondered what those complications might be worth to someone who could eliminate them permanently. The next day I called Summit's corporate offices and asked to speak with their acquisitions department. Within an hour I was sitting across from their development director, a sharp woman named Victoria Cross who listened to my proposition with the kind of focused attention that told me she understood exactly what I was offering. "Let me make sure I understand," she said carefully. "You have documentation that could force Hartwell into federal bankruptcy and criminal prosecution, and you're willing to provide that evidence to us instead of the authorities, for the right price?" I confirmed. "What did you have in mind?" $47 million, the exact amount they owe in back taxes. Victoria's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't laugh or call security. Instead, she asked, "Why that specific number?" "Because it's what justice costs." We negotiated for 2 hours. Victoria made calls to lawyers and executives and people whose titles I didn't recognize. By the end of the meeting, we had an agreement. Summit would pay me $47 million for exclusive access to my father's evidence, with the understanding that they would handle the legal proceedings in whatever way served their business interests. The contract took a week to finalize. During that time, I continued working at the diner, watching Croft abuse his employees and steal their wages while having no idea that his entire world was about to crumble. I thought about my father every day, wondering if he would approve of what I was planning. He'd spent 15 years building airtight cases for the government, believing in official justice and legal procedures. But official justice hadn't helped him when he was dying alone while his daughter begged for basic human compassion from a man who saw people as disposable. The day the payment cleared in my account, I walked into the diner for my final shift. Croft stood behind the register, counting cash drawer receipts with his usual scowl, probably calculating how much he could skim without anyone noticing. I approached him with a single piece of paper in my hand. "Croft, I need to give you something." He looked up with irritation. "Make it quick, we're busy." I placed the document on the counter between us. It was Summit Restaurant Group's payment receipt, clearly showing a $47 million transaction for acquisition of regulatory compliance documentation regarding Hartwell Food Services tax obligations. Croft stared at the paper for a long moment, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to absolute horror. "What is this?" he whispered. "That's the receipt for selling your company to your biggest competitor," I said calmly. "They bought all the evidence my father compiled about your tax evasion, wage theft, and fraud operations. Tomorrow morning, they'll present everything to federal prosecutors and offer to cooperate fully with the investigation in exchange for immunity." Croft's face went completely white. "Your father was a forensic accountant for the Treasury Department who spent 2 years documenting every crime you've committed. The government lost his files when he died, but I found them. And I sold them to Summit for exactly the amount you owe in back taxes." The paper trembled in Croft's hands as the full implications hit him. Not only was his company about to face federal prosecution, but their main competitor now owned all the evidence and could control the timing and scope of the legal proceedings to maximize their own business advantage. "You killed us," he breathed, finally understanding the magnitude of what I'd orchestrated. "No," I corrected, untying my apron one final time. "You killed yourselves. I just made sure you paid for it." I walked toward the exit, leaving Croft standing there clutching that receipt like it might spontaneously combust and take his problems with it. But I wasn't finished yet. The real beauty of my plan was just beginning to unfold. Within 6 hours, Summit's legal team had filed preliminary motions with federal court, presenting themselves as concerned competitors who discovered evidence of systematic tax fraud. They positioned themselves as civic-minded corporate citizens helping law enforcement uncover criminal activity. The media coverage painted them as heroes, while Hartwell became the poster child for corporate corruption. By Wednesday, federal agents were conducting raids on all 17 Hartwell locations. They seized computers, financial records, and arrested 3 executives. including the regional manager who'd been Croft's direct supervisor. The man who taught Croft how to manipulate employee schedules and skim cash receipts was now facing 20 years in federal prison. But the most beautiful part was watching Croft realize that his personal liability extended far beyond losing his job. As the on-site manager who'd implemented the fraudulent practices, who'd signed the false tax documents, who'd personally stolen thousands of dollars in employee tips, he was individually responsible for felony charges that could destroy his life completely. I spent that week visiting every former Hartwell employee I could find. Penny was working double shifts at a truck stop, trying to support her 2 kids after losing her health insurance when Hartwell closed. RU had moved back in with her parents because she couldn't afford rent without the job she'd worked for 4 years. The kitchen staff were scrambling to find new positions that would hire people without warning notices or references. Meanwhile, I was quietly planning the next phase of my revenge. The $47 million sat in my account like a weapon waiting to be deployed. I could have disappeared, bought a house somewhere warm, lived comfortably for the rest of my life without ever thinking about Croft or Hartwell or any of the people who'd been casualties in this corporate war. Instead, I did something that would have made my father proud. I established the Arlo Gardner Foundation for Workers' Rights, a legal advocacy organization dedicated to helping service industry employees fight wage theft, harassment, and labor violations. Our first action was hiring every displaced Hartwell worker at salaries that reflected their actual value, rather than what desperate people would accept. Penny became our operations coordinator, making more money than she'd ever imagined possible, while helping other single mothers navigate employment law. RU headed our documentation department, teaching workers how to record evidence of workplace violations. The kitchen staff formed our field investigation team, going undercover at restaurants and retail locations where employees reported suspicious practices. Within 3 months, we'd filed successful lawsuits against 12 companies in our area, recovering over $2 million in stolen wages and unpaid overtime. Workers started calling us when they faced retaliation for reporting safety violations or harassment. We became the organization that employers feared and employees trusted. But my personal attention remained focused on Croft. His legal troubles multiplied like bacteria in standing water. Federal charges for tax evasion and wire fraud, state charges for wage theft and labor violations, civil lawsuits from former employees seeking damages for stolen tips and unpaid overtime. The legal fees alone were devastating him financially, and that was before any judgments or settlements. I made sure to attend every court hearing, sitting in the gallery where he could see me, never speaking, never engaging, just present as a reminder of how his own cruelty had orchestrated his destruction. His lawyer eventually filed a motion requesting that I be barred from the courtroom, claiming my presence was intimidating to his client. The judge denied the motion, noting that public trials were exactly that, public. As the criminal case progressed, more details emerged about the scope of Hartwell's fraud. They'd been operating shell companies in tax havens, falsifying employee records to avoid paying benefits, and systematically stealing from workers who had no resources to fight back. The investigation revealed that over 2,000 employees had been affected across all their locations. But the government's case relied entirely on my father's evidence, which meant I became a key witness in the prosecution. Every time I testified, I made sure to mention how Croft had refused my emergency leave request when my father was dying, how he'd threatened to fire me for prioritizing family over corporate profits. The jury looked at Croft with visible disgust when they heard that story. During the civil proceedings, something interesting happened. Croft's lawyer tried to argue that his client had been following corporate policies set by higher-level executives, that he was essentially a mid-level employee who didn't understand the legal implications of his actions. I had evidence to destroy that defense too. Through my foundation's investigation, we discovered that Croft had been receiving bonuses based on how much money he could save through operational efficiencies. Every dollar he stole from employee tips, every hour of overtime he refused to pay, every benefit he managed to deny, earned him personal rewards. He wasn't just following orders, he was profiting from theft. The prosecutor presented this evidence during the penalty phase, showing that Croft had received over $60,000 in bonuses for systematically stealing from workers who earned minimum wage. The judge called it particularly egregious and sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison. followed by 5 years of supervised probation. But prison was just the beginning of his consequences. The civil judgments totaled over $300,000, which effectively bankrupted him. His house was foreclosed, his car repossessed, his retirement savings seized to pay court-ordered restitution. His wife left him before the trial ended, taking their children to another state where they could start over without the shame of his notoriety. 6 months after his sentencing, I received a letter from Croft written in the careful handwriting of someone with too much time to think. It was partly confession, partly justification, and partly plea for forgiveness. He wrote about growing up poor, about feeling powerless in his own life, about how having authority over employees had made him feel important for the first time. He admitted that refusing my emergency leave had been pure spite, that he'd wanted to hurt someone the way he felt hurt by his own circumstances. The letter ended with him asking if I thought he deserved what had happened to him. I never responded. Instead, I focused on expanding the foundation's work. We opened offices in 3 neighboring states, hired employment lawyers who specialized in corporate fraud, and developed training programs that taught workers how to recognize and document violations. We partnered with investigative journalists who exposed companies that thought they could abuse employees without consequences. 2 years after Hartwell's collapse, we'd recovered over $15 million in stolen wages for workers across the region. Companies started changing their practices just to avoid being investigated by us. The mere mention of the Arlo Gardner Foundation was enough to make corporate executives review their employment policies. But the most satisfying moment came when Summit Restaurant Group contacted me about a potential problem. They'd acquired several Hartwell locations and discovered that some of the former managers had implemented similar fraudulent practices at their new jobs. These managers, trained by Croft and his superiors, were apparently incapable of operating honestly, even when working for different companies. "We want to make sure our operations are completely clean," Victoria Cross explained during our meeting. "Could your foundation conduct a comprehensive audit of our employment practices?" I agreed, but with conditions. Any violations we discovered would be reported to authorities, regardless of Summit's preferences. Any affected employees would receive full restitution plus damages. And Summit would implement ongoing monitoring systems to prevent future violations. Victoria accepted immediately. She understood that spending money on compliance was infinitely cheaper than facing the kind of destruction that had consumed Hartwell. During our audit, we found minor violations at 3 locations, all connected to former Hartwell managers who apparently couldn't break their habits of skimming tips and manipulating schedules. Summit fired them immediately and paid over $200,000 in restitution to affected workers. But they also did something unexpected. Victoria offered to fund an expansion of our foundation's work, providing resources to investigate corporate fraud nationwide. She wanted Summit to be publicly associated with workers' rights advocacy, to demonstrate that ethical business practices were profitable business practices. I accepted her proposal but insisted that our investigations would remain completely independent. We would pursue any company where we found evidence of violations, including Summit, if they ever betrayed their commitment to fair employment. 3 years after my father's death, the Arlo Gardner Foundation had become one of the most feared advocacy organizations in the country. We'd recovered over $50 million for workers, shut down dozens of fraudulent operations, and sent 23 executives to prison. I often thought about what Dad would say if he could see what his quiet, methodical work had ultimately accomplished. He'd spent 15 years building cases for the government, believing that official justice was the only legitimate path to accountability. But sometimes official justice needed help finding its way. Sometimes, the daughter of a forensic accountant had to sell evidence to corporate competitors to ensure that criminals face consequences for their actions. Sometimes revenge required patience, planning, and the willingness to transform personal pain into systemic change that protected thousands of other people from experiencing the same cruelty. I kept Croft's letter in my desk drawer, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of why this work mattered. His words revealed the mindset of someone who hurt others because he felt powerless in his own life, who chose to abuse his authority rather than use it responsibly. There were thousands of other managers like Croft, other companies like Hartwell, other workers being exploited by people who believed that desperation made theft acceptable. My father had given me the tools to fight them, I intended to use those tools until every stolen dollar was returned, every violated law was enforced, and every worker knew they had someone willing to fight for them. When their employers decided that profits mattered more than human dignity. The Foundation's newest investigation involved a chain of hotels where housekeeping staff reported systematic wage theft and sexual harassment. The evidence we'd gathered suggested connections to organized crime and political corruption that extended far beyond simple employment violations. It would be our biggest case yet, potentially involving hundreds of victims and millions of dollars in fraud. I thought about Croft in his prison cell, probably wondering how his casual cruelty toward a grieving waitress had led to the complete destruction of everything he'd built. He'd asked if he deserved what happened to him. The answer was simple. He deserved exactly what he'd given others. I just made sure he received it with compound interest.